Thank you very much, Nourhan. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in such a distinguished and dynamic group of people who are interested and active and motivated to make progress for world peace and security, in particular, thanks to disarmament. Now, if we talk about gender, the role of women in disarmament, of course, it seems to us like a recent issue or recent concern, and it's obviously is still very high on the agenda. It still requires a lot of action from the international community, but it's a long struggle, I would say. It actually one of the oldest NGOs is the Women International League for Peace and Freedom, which was started more than 100 years ago, and they of course they were very active and instrumental in pushing actually a system, a world system, which was based on the masculinity, patriarchate, etc., to give a proper role to women in this collective action for peace and security. And they are still very active. Of course, you may have heard about their specific program on arms control and disarmament called Reaching Critical Will. So if you're interested, I really advise you to follow what they're doing. It's also interesting that throughout history, when you learn about first arms control achievements, instruments, we go back to the early 1960s, after the first world crisis due to the risk of nuclear weapons, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and shortly afterwards, of course, there was this growing awareness of the risk of world catastrophe, but in particular in the United States, there had been already testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere for more than 20 years. So there was a campaign started by mothers, because doctors confirmed that mothers were feeding their babies with radioactive milk, and this was due to the nuclear testing. So this led actually to the first multilateral treaty on nuclear testing and nuclear weapons, the Partial Test Ban Treaty that prohibited testing in the atmosphere. And of course, it was not the end of nuclear testing. Nuclear testing continued in the atmosphere for on the part of some countries. And then, of course, underground, with also huge damage caused to the environment, and very often in the testing areas, in the testing sites, women were the first victims, because they were, as we know also from the history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they are more vulnerable and they suffered the most severe consequences, including in reproductive system, and therefore that will affect future generations. So there was this very strong demand from civil society to accept a specific role for women and specific action to give more power and more influence to women's groups, and this culminated actually 22 years ago with the adoption by the Security Council of the first major landmark resolution, Resolution 1325, which sort of established these foundations of recognizing and ensuring a specific role for women in peace processes, in security situations and in disarmament, but particularly through the peacebuilding activity dedicated to DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, where women very often play a decisive role, because they, depending on the countries, even when women are considered as second-class citizens in some countries, they culturally are, in a sense, powerful, because they are responsible for being in charge, responsible of the household, and in that way they can control what gets into the house, the home, and that allows to control the flow of weapons. You also remember that all the major instruments on arms control and disarmament that were initiated after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s were the result of campaigns by civil society and not initiatives by states. And among these civil society groups, women played a leading role. I remember the campaign to ban landmines that was headed by Jody Williams, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, and that campaign was sponsored and supported by Lady Diana. And then this affected the whole UN system. It was realized that it was about time to ensure that the UN itself, adapts its policies, its practices to give this equal or even better status to women. So, of course, the current Secretary General must be commended, because he has a very effective policy of sort of catching up and giving women sort of parity in all the positions of responsibility throughout the organization, and in particular in the field of disarmament. Now we have the High Representative for Disarmament, who is a woman, Izumi Nakamitsu. We have of course, the Director General of the UN in Geneva, who is also Secretary General of the Conference on Disarmament, who's a woman. And then her deputy, the head of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva, is also a woman. And at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, where I worked for a couple of years, we've had 2 female directors. Now it's sort of back to the turn of a man, but UNIDIR has a specific program to deal with the role of gender issues and the role of women in disarmament, headed by Renata Delacroix. So all this has affected all these arms control, disarmament treaties and processes. Remember that also thanks to a campaign by women's organizations, now we have a specific provision in the Arms Trade Treaty, in Article 7, a legal obligation for exporting states to include in their risk assessments about the impact of their exports, whether the weapons could be used to commit gender-based violence or crimes against women and children. So this is a very important provision, and this is a result, again, of a very effective campaign from women's organizations. And more recently, of course, in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that is the result of a campaign by major coalition of NGOs, also headed by a woman, Beatrice Finn, by the way, former GCSP staff. But she led this campaign that managed to convince diplomats to include in the treaty specific provisions recognizing you know, the role of women and the fact that they are vulnerable and mostly affected by nuclear testing or the use of nuclear weapons. So in Geneva, as you know, this is the capital of multilateralism, where all these processes take place, and it's not, again, by accident that it was in Geneva at the Maison de la Paix where GCSP is, but also other important centers like DCAF or the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining. All the actors, the main actors in Geneva at Maison de la Paix, established a Geneva Gender and Diversity Hub. And so all the leaders of these organizations you know, declare themselves as gender champions. So that means they agree to promote gender equality and diversity. And so I can only, if, like, I can share the link. I can share the
sorry,
link.
I will mute. This is, please, could you please mute the microphone to engage this? Okay, I will mute. Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. You can continue.
Sorry, let me just share the link of the Geneva Gender Hub. So you can go there and see all the activities that they organize in terms of, I think you can.
I will mute all. Yes. Oh, give me 1 second. Okay. I'm sorry. No, it's good.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so just to conclude on this notes, because you mentioned, you kindly mentioned GCSP. Of course, we've had this policy not only of being a member of this Geneva Gender Hub, but also including in all our activities, in particular our executive education, specific courses on arms control and disarmament, with also to include the gender dimension. So whenever we talk about the Arms Trade Treaty, we have a specific session on gender-based violence, which is you know, delivered by experts in this field from civil society. And let me just, because you know, I could mention a lot of statistics, but I think it's always good to refer to specific examples, you know, stories, success stories of impact. So I can mention the case of a Palestinian female diplomat, junior diplomat, and so she came to GCSP and took part in several courses on the one that we do for specifically for the Middle East and North Africa region on arms control, and another one on the Arms Trade Treaty. And at the end of these courses, she came back to us and she said, you know, this is fantastic, all I learned. And so I'm going to recommend to my president that Palestine accede to these treaties. And that was done. So you could say that the fact that now Palestine is a state party to all these treaties is the direct result of our training. So we are very proud of this, and it shows that you know, we can only succeed if we all work together. So best wishes for your action, and again, I commend you for organizing this initiative.